I'm here today with Ross Murray. Ross is the author of a book that's just coming out called Made, Known, and Loved, Developing LGBTQ-Inclusive Youth Ministry. Ross is the founding director of the Naming Project, a faith-based youth ministry and summer camp for LGBT youth and their allies. He's worked with youth and families in a variety of settings and presented LGBTQ youth ministry around the world. In his day job, Ross is the Senior Director of Education and Training at the GLAAD, G-L-A-A-D, Media Institute, providing activist, spokesperson, and media engagement training and education for the LGBTQ community members, corporations, the media industry, and advocacy organizations designed to accelerate acceptance of the LGBT community. Ross has secured national media interest in stories that bring examples of LGBTQ equality access across diverse communities in America, with specialty in the relationship between the religion and LGBTQ people. Ross is a consecrated deacon in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, with a specific calling to advocate for LGBTQ people and to bridge the LGBTQ and faith communities. He's a producer for the Yes Jesus podcast, a faith and sexuality affirming podcast that believes you don't have to pick between gay and God. In 2014, he was named one of Mashable's 10 LGBT rights activists to follow on Twitter. So Ross, congratulations, first of all, on all of this. I mean, it's really wonderful for you to be coming out with this book.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited. This is a whole new venture for me. Despite you just named like 3 other things, but I was like, let's try something else too. We'll add that to the list. Well,
you're kind of like me in that, I just love launching new things. So, you clearly have that attribute as well.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. I like projects, and I like to see kind of real world impact. And you can sort of see it's been this sort of overlap between advocacy work and like community youth ministry type care. That's kind of been my sweet spot, and I can sort of branch out from each of those. But that's always sort of been a little bit the center of my vocation.
Well, it's been wonderful. I mean, you've kind of been swimming upstream, right? By trying to, tie the faith world to the LGBT community. A lot of times that's difficult, at least within some faith traditions.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I grew up and came out, I don't know, relatively early 20s. So not as a teenager, but I was really fortunate to have a really accepting faith community and an accepting family. And I think I didn't realize until later in life that was not true for everybody else. I assumed that was going to be that was going to be kind of, the norm. And as I sort of grew up and went to college, other folks sort of, questioned like, how do you have this faith? There's, what kind of discrimination? And I was sort of, okay, because I was in a really comfortable place. And I'll say it wasn't until I experienced my own experience of discrimination to realize like, oh, this is real. And if I have this, which is with as much privilege as I have, imagine what this is like for others who don't have a family and a caring faith community and a sort of a background, of course, and I kind of get it, like why people would walk away, because sometimes for us, the church is our entire life. And if that gets taken away from us, we kind of don't know who we are. And I think it's important for us to make sure that we know who we are, even apart from a community.
Absolutely. So before we dive into the book, could you tell us a little bit about like the Naming Project and GLAAD and what you do at those?
Sure. The Naming Project is an LGBTQ youth ministry, primarily a summer camp that we operate for a week out of July in central Minnesota. And we've had youth ages 14 to 18 who come and get to have this queer church camp experience. If you've been to a church camp, you will probably recognize the structure, like the daily schedule is the same. And what makes it really LGBTQ is the people that participate, the campers, the youth themselves. We try to make sure that there are adults that can be role models or possibility models, sort of seeing what faithful, healthy adulthood in Christianity is like. And then young people that are coming from kind of a whole variety of faith backgrounds, no faith, actually mostly within the Christian sphere. Although we've had a Jewish camper, we've had several agnostic campers who just like the experience and enjoy it and go through it with us. And it's been really interesting to sort of see them engage in Bible study, in arts and crafts, in campfire, in worship songs, and kind of put themselves into this community. It's a community that sort of knows that they're marginalized and really wants to practice care for each other. And that's been the biggest thing that I've noticed. And I'm hoping that will always help to produce adults who are, again, healthy, happy, faithful adults. And in the GLAD portion of my life, that's kind of my day job, is an LGBTQ advocacy organization that works primarily with the media and media representation of LGBTQ people. So GLAD works a lot with journalism, with film, with television, and now gaming, comic books, social media, pop culture, those things that sort of influence culture and acceptance and understanding and awareness of the LGBTQ community. So we're less political, we're less legal, but our lane is what's the media narrative about this, even for political things or legal things. And how do people know and understand that? So how do we tell stories that reach people in their hearts and in their minds to help build that acceptance for the LGBTQ community? And those two things, they're separate, but there's an area of overlap where the two kind of end up reinforcing each other, where I've had young people from the Naming Project who have been a part of magazine articles or television because of their experience at our camp through my work at GLAD. And, reporters are coming to GLAD saying, is there a young person who's had an experience, or can you talk about faith? And that means I'm kind of the lead faith person for GLAD.
Well, it's really great that you've got such a structured way to influence the influencers.
Yeah, and I'm finding that you mentioned before kind of that conflict that people have between faith and sexuality. And I think that I'm finding more and more people that are rejecting that as a binary that people have to. Good. Yeah, and my goal since I've been at GLAD has been, how do I find ways to lift up those stories? And so it's everyday people, it's my campers and my fellow adults that work through the Naming Project. I'm finding those folks in pop culture and celebrity. That's where the podcast Yes, Jesus came from. It was the actor Daniel Francesi that came up with this idea and wanted to share his story as a gay Christian and what his history and his story was, and then who he is today and how he still has a relationship with God and understands himself as a gay man. And even we were discussing before we started bringing this to, like the breaking news this morning of Colton Underwood, the Bachelor, also talking about his faith as well as a part of his story, and recognizing that people want to explicitly say, I'm not giving up my faith, even as I know this is part of who God made me to be. And I love that. And I cheer that on, and I want to keep that momentum going for other folks.
I mean, thank goodness. I mean, more and more of the population is really becoming accepting of all the aspects of different LGBT issues and people and everything. So that's, a good thing to see. But it seems like the last holdouts, unfortunately, in many cases are within, some of the more conservative faith groups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think the acceptance has grown so much in the last 10, 20, 30 years from where we used to be. But the opposition has gotten kind of louder and nastier. They used to have the majority of the population on their side, and now they don't. So, and I think what gets really hard is there's a lot of people that are really accepting, but it's hard for them to know what to do to be accepting and how to be helpful. And so right now, we've got dozens of really horrendous anti-LGBTQ bills that are being introduced and passed in state legislatures and signed into law by governors. And there's a lot of people that if they realized the harm that these bills are causing to young LGBTQ people, especially young transgender people, that they would be up in arms about this. But I think that I don't know what to do, or I don't realize this is happening, continues to kind of keep people into a place of complacency. And so my work as an advocate for the LGBTQ community is sort of to always remind people this is what's at stake. This is where people are being harmed, and this is what you can do to help. Because I think people want to be helpful, but don't know how to be helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I totally hear that. And I'm glad that you guys are, focusing a spotlight on some of these issues.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, I mean, to bridge a little bit over into the book, the Made Known Love book, that was the same kind of impotence of we had these youth directors, youth ministry people, pastors that knew they were going to have LGBTQ youth and didn't know what to do. Didn't know what's going to be the right way to listen and care for them. And some people learn it through trial and error, but you don't want to be the kid that has to be the trial, or the kid that ends up being the error. Yeah. And so what's a way that we can proactively tell people, these are some ways to think. These are some questions to ask yourself. These are some things you can do to help. And, it's not easy cut and dry answers, but it's a little bit of be aware of this. Ask yourself these questions. Look around for what's happening. And that's the youth ministry side. The same thing happens in the advocacy side as well.
Wow. So tell us how the book came about.
The book came about because ever since our foundation of the Naming Project, which is around 2003 with our first camp in 2004,
wow. Goes back that far.
Yeah, we've been doing this for a while.
I didn't realize that. It was that long living.
We just got questions from the beginning about how do you do, even before we knew what we were doing ourselves. So in 2003, we were planning the 2004 camp, and we'd go out and advertise, and people would say, how are you going to do sleeping arrangements? Like that was the first and most common question. And, it's odd because we didn't know the answer to that question ourselves quite yet. We were working through it and figured it out for ourselves that first year in the first camp. But we'd go to like youth ministry conferences and talk about this, and we get more questions. And it's interesting. I open the book sort of with a story of I was at a reception at a youth ministry conference of someone that had heard me speak, and she wanted to ask me, she wanted to get more insight. And her question was, what do lesbians do, sexually? And I realized I am not a qualified person to answer this question. And I'm in a crowded room with people. And I was like, do I make a joke? Do I, say I don't have experience with that? And I realized what it was, that she had a young person in her life, a young girl who was coming out and probably asking her questions as a straight woman of what can I do? What should I do? How do I do this? And she didn't feel qualified. So she just had this guy that said, I'm gay and I do youth ministry. Well, maybe he knows. So she came to me. And so I realized that we got questions like that sort of over and over again. And so the book ended up being structured around questions like, what are we getting asked? And what's the ways in which we can answer those questions? And none of the answers are as simple as people want them to be, which is why they can be entire chapters. Just saying, here's the question, but here's everything that's behind the question. And here's everything you have to think about before you actually realize what the correct answer is for you in your particular time and in your particular setting.
Wow. So the new book is being published by Fortress Press. Can you talk just a little bit about how that relationship came about?
Yeah, I've known Fortress Press for a long time. They're a good Lutheran publishing house, and I'm a good Lutheran. So they've kind of always been the one that I was probably more familiar with than anyone else. I've worked with them before. In fact, last year I was a contributor to a book that was geared at LGBTQ Christian youth and adults that work with them. So Queerfully and Wonderfully Made and Welcoming and Affirming came out just a little less than a year ago now. And I got to be part of the creative jam that figured out what questions are young people asking, and what are ways that we can answer those questions. So I did that just before I kind of really buckled down and started working on my own book as well. And I was kind of doing the two a little bit at the same time. And so, and what's interesting for GLAAD, my last trip that I took before quarantine of the coronavirus was to do a LGBTQ competency training for the staff of Fortress Press and their overarching company, which is called 1517 Media. And so by that point, Fortress had acquired the book. I was under contract. So I was training my editor, my acquisitions editor, on LGBTQ people and acceptance and what to do at work and what's happening and also sharing with them, oh, by the way, I've worked with you before, and I've got friends that work here and colleagues, and hello to you, and hello to you, and hello to you, and and folks like my editor who's in the room, and getting out of that conversation, which is great because that was the first time we met face to face. We went to lunch. She taught me a little bit more about, well, here's what the process is. Sounds like it's good. Did a little coaching for me, like one-on-one, and then the coronavirus and being in quarantine is a great reason to finish doing all the editing that you're supposed to do anyway.
Really, really. Well, that's a great story, and I'm glad that you've had such a good relationship with Fortress.
Yeah, they've been good. I'm sure I'm bugging their marketing people more than they'd like, and that's probably a first-time author thing, sort of saying, okay, what's happening now? What's next? What are sales like? Can you give me a graphic? Can you do this thing? What's on my own? I'm doing a lot of it on my own too, and I think it's a good practice for me to learn how to do. It's a very different skill set than writing.
I have to believe that a lot of their first-time authors, pester them with the same kinds of questions.
They probably should have a document of like, these are the questions you'll get, and these are just the paragraphs of answers. We'll just paste those into what you say.
Well, the book comes out April 20th, if I'm
Yes.
mistaken. Is that correct?
Yeah. So less than a week.
Right. That'll be a great event. What about plans going forward? Do you have any thoughts on future books that you might be doing?
I'm working on a few things, and I need to spend some of this time kind of rededicating some work to Yes Jesus. I think we've been doing really well for a year, and I'm excited to sort of bring it to the next level. I think, have another book in my head, and I've got to talk to I got to talk to Fortress. I got to talk to my own employer, like the Naming Project, and even my work for GLAAD, because I end Made Known Loved with a little bit of a call to action of how do you do youth ministry to LGBTQ youth that are not coming into your church building? And how do you recognize what's happening in the world and step up as people whose calling is to build the faith of LGBTQ people? Can you do that out in public? And what does that look like? And I believe that public advocacy is a part of that public witness to our faith. And our churches have been really hesitant to do that. And I think the stakes have gotten higher and higher and higher. And I want to help faith leaders, everyday people in the pews, churches, kind of figure out where that sweet spot is of doing public advocacy. And LGBTQ is often my lens, but there's so much other stuff that's happening. And there's ways that churches really are showing up, but I think I want to accelerate that. We've got to figure out how to do that and feel like, and I think that's a little bit about what the next one might look like, but it has not taken a very like clear form yet. So there's a lot of conversation needs to happen before any movement happens there.
I think that's a really important area to contribute because, I mean, as you said, churches really need to change and evolve and have less of a focus inside their own walls and more of a focus, out to their communities.
Yeah. Even with the questions that we got, and again, this book is so framed around questions. It's a little bit, how do I deal with this gay kid in my youth group? How do I deal with this transgender kid? Even a question like sleeping arrangements is a little bit, how do I deal with that, right? We used to have an old assumption that boys go over here and girls go over there, and we'll keep them separate. And the introduction of a gay kid or a transgender kid or bisexual kid, that changes all of those assumptions. But then, there's some folks that aren't going to come to your church because the predominant assumption is that churches are hostile places unless you're making really, really overt messages otherwise. And even if they don't come to our church, they're still children of God. And we need to figure out how we step up and care for them, even if they're not in our direct community or inside our walls. And that means us having to go either to where they are or go to where they are most in danger or under attack. And that goes back to these state legislatures, right? It goes back to, where's the source of the harm coming from? Can I go there and stop it and say, as a minister of the church, and as someone who's been called to proclaim the gospel in the world, a law that bans doctors from treating transgender youth goes against Christian values and witness, and to be able to say that over and over again in different times and ways and places, and encouraging for good protection for young people. I think that is a message that would be good for the church, and it would absolutely be helpful for the marginalized people that end up getting hurt and crushed under these laws.
Amen. Amen. And as you said, I mean, what you just described transcends just the LGBTQ set of issues.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? There's lots of other things that fall into that same kind of category.
Yeah. And I'm trying to, the other thing I'm working on, this is the more immediate. The book was good, but now I'm trying to make worksheets, realize oh, I told you to ask a bunch of questions. I should make that its own separate handout. So I'm starting to put those together, and I'm going to start putting those up on my website and doing a mailing list there too, to sort of say, if you want some worksheets to help you think through stuff, go to, rossmurray.org, and you can, and sign up for the mailing list, and we can mail you some of that stuff. So good. That's my most immediate next plan.
Yes. Well, you're following some of our, platform development advice. So I'm glad to hear that.
Exactly. I will admit I did it wrong. I made a website for the book first, and then realized and then your advice was the website should be for you as the author, not the book. And I went, oh, okay. So madeknownlove.org and rossmurray.org both go to the same website, and I can kind of say the one, and we'll fix it after the fact. But
no, that's not, there's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, that's, you want to be able to draw in people from whichever avenue they, come to you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm excited about kind of doing this continued work. And I think there's going to be, I'm hoping this will also lead to more churches and church bodies getting to ask questions. My colleagues at the Naming Project really are brilliant. I heavily cite one of them in a workshop that he's done in this book. His name's Logan, and he's a seminary student, but was brilliant before he ever started seminary, and does a great workshop that just looks at, it's a good crossover of the state of our world, and here's where LGBTQ youth fall in it. It explains queer theology without having to explain queer theology, and looks at the Bible and walks people kind of through this understanding. And I think that's really going to be helpful for folks that have been working in ministry settings, that everything is kind of cut and dry, and LGBTQ youth are messy, and queerness is messy, and God's action in the world is usually pretty messy. So it seems like it's needed right now.
Excellent. Well, Ross, congratulations again on the new book and all the wonderful work that you've done. Very impressive, and so glad to see it.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me on here. I've really enjoyed being a part of the community of Writing for Your Life, and for your compassionate Christianity work as well.
Well, thanks so much. Good luck with the rest of the book launch, Ross.
All right, thanks.